We've discussed Aristotle, who takes happiness, in a certain sense, as the foundation of his moral theory. That is the ultimate end of all of our action. In fact, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he starts the entire work by saying every action, every art, every inquiry is aimed at some good. Therefore, there is a good at which all actions aim, and it turns out that that ultimate good is happiness. Well, suppose we took that idea and ran with it in a different direction. We might think, all right, every art, every inquiry, every action are aimed ultimately at happiness. So what really matters is producing happiness, right? The more happiness there is in the world, the better the world is. The less happiness, the worse the world is, all other things equal. And so you might think, yes, let's imagine that that's really our moral goal. Not that my moral goal is to live well and be happy, and that yours is for you to live well and be happy, but suppose we thought happiness is what really matters. We want to produce happiness. There are a number of different ways we might take that. You might say, here's a very simple rule that would reflect that. Act for the best. That is to say, produce the best outcome. Come up with something that will have the best possible results, where we measure best in terms of happiness. Or here's another way of putting it. Make the world a better place. A lot of people would say, yeah, one of my goals in life is to make the world a better place. I want it to be a better place because I've lived here. And that's a way of thinking about consequences. What are the consequences of what you do? So those are thoughts that are basic to utilitarianism. There are different kinds of moral theory, and utilitarianism is one specific kind that is different, I think, from Aristotle's or Confucius's or most other moral theories we encounter here. You might think of an action as proceeding in something like this way. I start out being a person who has a certain character. I have some character traits. Some of them are good, we call those virtues. Some are bad, we call them vices. A lot might be just neutral. There are things about my character that are neither really in general good or bad. But then I form, before I act, I have some particular motive for action. I have some reason for acting, and I think, all right, here's my motivation. I want to accomplish this goal, let's say. And then I choose an action. And so I decide to actually act. I perform this action, and then that has certain effects. Well, you could take any step there as foundational in a moral theory. Or you could take them all as independently important, as Confucius seems to do. But you could say, for example, let's focus on character. I think character is the most important thing. And then you're going to be talking about good and bad character traits, virtues and vices. Or you could say, I think it's really motives and intentions that are the most fundamental thing. And in that case, you would be talking about, well, a variety of things that would mean that my intentions are good, my motives are good, I'm acting for good reasons. We'll see a philosopher later, Immanuel Kant, who has a theory like that. You could think that it's really a question of just what action I perform. And lots of people have thought about ethics in that way. They think naturally in terms of rules or principles. Things you ought to do, things you shouldn't do. Think of like classic statements of moral rules. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Those are things that involve the kind of action and just focus on the action. They don't ask, why are you doing it? What kind of character do you have? They aren't talking about effects. They just go directly to the nature of the action. But then you can also think about the effects of the action. And that's what utilitarianism does. It says, let's focus on this question of the results, the effects, the consequences of the action, and think about whether they're good or bad. The person in Western philosophy who really begins utilitarianism, the idea is there in some dialogues of Plato, but it's really not advocated by anyone very explicitly up until the time of Jeremy Bentham. Bentham was somebody who was trying to bring scientific thinking to philosophy, to law, to ethics in particular. And he was himself a sort of remarkable character. He was a child prodigy. He went to Oxford by the time he was 12. He emerged at 19 with a law degree, but he decided not to practice law. He thought English law at the time was such a confusing mess that it was a waste of his and everybody else's time. And so he embarked on a career dedicated to writing and to legal reform. He had all sorts of ideas, many of which did get implemented. It is largely due to Jeremy Bentham that physical punishments, that corporal punishments like flogging, were abolished in Britain. On the other hand, he had some other ideas for prison reform that never did get implemented. His grand idea was the panopticon, a prison where everybody would be in these cells around a central guard thing, and everyone would be able to see everyone else, so that nothing you could do would be private. People then found it creepy too. And so that prison never got built until here at UT we had a conference in honor of his 250th birthday, and we actually had a bakery bake an Italian cream cake on the model of the panopticon with the windows in the right places and everything. They were little chocolate mints. It was delightful. I don't think his prison would have been as tasty, but in any case, Bentham was so dedicated to getting rid of superstition and other things like that, that he insisted that upon his death, his body be stuffed and displayed in the library of University College London, which he helped to found. And what you see pictured there is that body. It's called the auto icon, and there's a webcam on it. So at any point you can say, "How you doing today, Jeremy?" and check this out. At that conference, we were all lecturing to a video link of Jeremy Bentham's body. It was very creepy. Anyway, that is actually a bronze cast of his head made when he was dead. The actual head is sitting at his feet. Yeah, now why? Okay, oops. Good question. Why on earth would he do that? Well, he thought there were lots of superstitions about death, and he wanted you to think about it scientifically. And so having himself stuffed and put on display through a bit of taxidermy was really his way of trying to get you over superstitions about death. In general, he thought that English law, that morality, were filled with all these superstitious, weird ideas. And that if we just thought in terms of effects on human happiness, we can clear away a lot of those suspicions and think clearly about law, about morality, and lots of other things in life. So, he advocates one principle as the foundation for all moral thinking, and he calls it the principle of utility. He says by the principle of utility is meant the principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what is the same thing, in other words, to promote or oppose that happiness. Now that's a very complicated statement of this principle, and in my ethical theories class we take that apart bit by bit, phrase by phrase, and spend a whole class period just unpacking that one statement of principle. I think we're not going to spend our time that way today, but it is something that has a lot of things going on in it, and the parts are there for a reason. Now, as you can probably tell by looking at this, Bentham was not the greatest salesman for his theories. His writing is not the best writing. You are going to see a number of philosophers in this course who I think are very good writers. You're going to see some others who are not very good writers. And don't imitate the ones that aren't very good writers. Imitate the good ones. I would not claim that Bentham is somebody to be imitated. In fact, he wrote all of this stuff in his own shorthand. He had developed his own shorthand so that he could write very, very quickly. And he did produce thousands of pages. There is now an effort to try to get everything he wrote published. They estimate that it will take 80 volumes. So he wrote a huge amount. And much of it in the shorthand that only a few people in the world can read. In any case, he was concerned with getting his ideas on paper quickly, not always with literary expression. John Stuart Mill puts essentially the same idea in a much more elegant fashion. Mill was also a child prodigy. He was taught by his father, James Mill, an economist, and also by Jeremy Bentham. He was already translating Latin and Greek by the time he was 6. He took over the education of all the other Mill children by the time he was 8. And he was, he was a really remarkable figure. Near the end of his life, he was elected to Parliament, even though he refused to campaign or do anything to actually support the effort to elect him to Parliament. Anyway, here is the way he puts this principle of utility. The creed, which accepts as the foundations of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So an action is right to the extent that it makes people happy. An action is wrong to the extent that it makes people unhappy. But we've got to think about people in general here, not just the person performing the action. I might do something that makes me happy, but you unhappy. And your happiness has to be taken into account too. So for both Bentham and Mill, we're talking here not just about the happiness of the person performing the action, but the happiness of everybody, the happiness of everyone who might be affected by this action. Now, notice something important about this. He talks about proportions here. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. And so he is not giving us a criterion. He's not saying, here is my definition of a right action or a wrong action. Things can be more or less right, more or less wrong. There's a proportion here. So he's establishing a scale. This is very different from the way most people have approached moral thinking. Most give you rules and tell you, obey these rules, do this, don't do that. Or they give you some criterion that your action has to meet to be acceptable, to be permissible. He's not doing that. He's saying, I'm going to tell you which actions are better than which ones are worse. And so we get a scale of better and worse. We don't really get directly out of what he says any indication of what is wrong, what you must do, etc. So imagine that we have 4 options. We could arrange them, let's say, on a scale like this, depending upon their tendencies to produce happiness or the reverse of happiness. And so some of them might be better. I've got it arranged so that option 1 is the highest on the scale. It's the best of these actions. Option 2, it still produces more happiness than unhappiness, but it's not as good as option 1. I've got a little 0 there, which indicates that it's the effects on happiness and unhappiness just balance out. It makes no net effect at all. Option 3, well, produces more unhappiness than happiness, but worst of all is option 4. It produces a lot more unhappiness than happiness. Now, if those are the options, what do you think you ought to do? 1 is the best action, right? And so it's a very plausible thought to say you ought to do 1. And indeed, sometimes the utilitarians, and modern utilitarians distinguish the 2 options I'm about to mention. But in Bentham and Mill, they're sort of mixed together. They don't really have a very clear way of distinguishing them. One way is to say, choose the best action, right? Pick option 1 in this case. Always pick the best action. Maximize happiness. Produce as much happiness for the world as possible. Don't just leave the world a better place. Leave it as better off as you could possibly have made it. Now, another way of looking at it is to say, well, at least produce more happiness than unhappiness. All right, you don't, option 1's the best option, but maybe you don't have to pick option 1. Option 2 also makes people on balance happy. So pick 1 or 2. Those are different strategies. So sometimes Bentham and Mill talk as if they're kind of permissive. As long as you're contributing to happiness, you're okay. Other times, they seem to say, no, you must do the best possible thing. I think we could distinguish 2 questions. What should I do, and what must I do? And one way of looking at this is to say, what I should do is choose the best action. Choose option 1 here. It's the best thing. It produces the most happiness. But what must I do? Do I have to pick option 1? It's the best thing. I really ought to pick it, but maybe it would be okay to pick option 2. And that's a distinction that a lot of philosophers don't make, but I think it's actually a helpful one. You might say, well, here's the thing you really ought to do. This is the best option. But if not that, then choose among these, okay? Definitely don't do those. And one way of looking at this is to say, okay, best option. The thing you really ought to do is option 1. Option 2, well, it's okay. It's not the best thing. Options 3 and 4 are not okay. One reason people have sometimes drawn this distinction is to allow for the possibility that certain actions are supererogatory. Now, what does that mean? It's an ugly word taken over from the Latin. That means basically above and beyond what is asked. Super, that's the above part, and rogatory, above what is asked, above what is demanded. So these are actions that go above and beyond the call of duty. And if you think that's something that makes sense, some people not only do a good thing, but go beyond the call of duty and actually do more than is required, then you can say, okay, maybe option 1 is like that. It's heroic to choose option 1, maybe it's okay, but not as good to choose option 2. And so that would be another way of looking at this scale. But I want to stress, Bentham and Mill don't give you an exact way of looking at the scale. They're just giving you the better and worse, and leaving it a bit ambiguous as to what you have to do. Yeah?
Can't being like a super derogatory person negate Aristotle and Confucius's ideals of virtue?
That's an interesting question. How does this relate to the ideal of virtue that we find in Aristotle and Confucius? what would it be like to be a moral hero in this respect? Can you imagine a case where, for example, honesty would be something that would be like that, would seem like it goes above and beyond the call of duty to be honest in that situation?
That example of like if you walk in and you find your parents smoking weed and you call the cops on them.
Ooh, you find your parents smoking weed and you call the cops on them. Is that going above and beyond the call of duty? Is that like, wow, you're a moral hero for turning in your parents? You know, that actually happened in May. There was a police officer talking to first graders about drug paraphernalia and how bad drugs are and so on, and said, you know, if you ever see something that looks like this, you know, this is called a bong. If you ever see this, you let me know. And so the little kid promptly in class said, my mom and dad have one of those in the bedroom. And mom and dad got busted. And it led to a public outcry because people said, wait, we're now having first graders inform on their kid parents. But anyway, that's something that, yeah, I don't know if I want to call that moral heroism. But there might be cases where, you know, you would, look, it's not a great thing to lie, but you might say, you're going to lose so much by telling the truth that it actually feels heroic to tell the truth. That might be a case like this. Yeah?
So I guess in some circumstances to that, or like examples like that, would you be going from the mean between extremes to the extreme?
That's a good question. How would Aristotle or Confucius think about this? Is that a matter of going to the extreme, in which case it no longer looks like a virtue? Or is that sort of sticking to the mean, even at great cost to yourself? I think they would say, actually, these cases of moral heroism do fit their concepts of virtue. It's a question of being in that mean even when the cost of remaining in the mean is immensely high. So think about the soldier who sacrifices himself, let's say, jumping onto the grenade that otherwise could have killed the whole platoon. That person is doing something immensely courageous. It's not that they go to some extreme. No, it is highly virtuous. It's just that it comes at a very high personal cost. The person who just tried to get away, you might think, didn't behave in the best moral way, but on the other hand, you wouldn't really blame somebody for that. You would think, that's an understandable way of responding. But what they did was actually do the thing that is in the mean, even at huge personal cost. So I think that's how they would think. Yeah?
The way I kind of see it is almost maybe like a bell curve, and so like the supererogatory stuff is kind of like the apex or the maximum of the bell curve, and the vices are on either side, and so long as you act within a certain range, you're still considered virtuous, but if you
I actually really like that way of looking at it. Sometimes people act as if the mean, in fact Aristotle talks as if the mean is just one point here. And I've said, look, it would be a lot more plausible to think of it as a range. But once you start thinking of it as the utilitarians do, you're thinking, wait, I mean, it's not just courageous, not courageous. There's more courageous and less courageous, right? More cowardly and less cowardly. And so you might think, really, it goes something like this with amounts of courage. And then you might say the hero is somebody who's way up there at the maximum. I like that way of thinking about it a lot. It strikes me as much more plausible than the just binary, no, suddenly you're virtuous, boom, suddenly you're not. Yeah, it seems to me there's more and less of all the virtues too. Yeah?
Sorry, like I mean in the sense of like if you did give your mean audit to that homeless man, you would be going above and beyond your duty to help a part of your community. But you said that negates the, like, that goes above, that goes too far on Aristotle and Confucius' line of what kindness or giving.
All right, that's an interesting point. What about the person who dedicates themselves so much to helping others, for example, that they really do suffer themselves? They go into the diseased area and bring medicine, even though it is at the cost of their own life.
Like we need those people, but I mean, don't these two ideals end up like kind of going against each other?
There is a potential clash there, for sure, because I could think, I mean, depending on what you think my interests really are, but you could think that the person who behaves rashly, in some cases, looks like the moral hero. The person who does the thing that actually seems unwise in that situation actually seems to be the one who we look at as deserving of the Congressional Medal of Honor, rather than just, congratulations, you did a good job. And indeed, so yeah, I think you really have to talk about individual cases and go hard into how Aristotle would react, because I don't think it's an easy matter to tell what he really thinks constitutes going too far in some of these respects. Yeah?
So when we think of the options, whose happiness do we consider? Other people's or our own?
Ooh, good point. We are thinking here about happiness for the entire group, happiness for everyone. So it is very important in doing this and examining things on the scale. We're thinking not just of my happiness, but everyone's happiness. And indeed, that's something that Bentham is going to stress. Okay, at one point he says, an act conforms to utility if the tendency it has to augment the happiness of the community is greater than it has to diminish it. So here he seems to be what is sometimes called a satisficing utilitarian. That is to say, doing enough. You're doing enough as long as you're making a positive contribution to happiness. You're cool with utility. Now, the person who goes beyond the positive and actually does more than that, chooses option 1 instead of merely option 2, is doing something supererogatory, is going above and beyond the call of duty from that point of view. And so that's one way of thinking about this. And indeed, lots of times in decisions, we're doing this. We're satisficing. That is to say, we're looking for enough. Let's suppose I need a new shirt. I go out to buy a shirt. Do I think, all right, I want the best possible shirt for the amount of money I'm willing to spend, so I spend lots of time looking at shirts? Probably not. I have some idea. I think, okay, I don't want to spend any more than that. Here's one. That's cool. And I just choose it. All right? It's good enough. I don't worry about maximizing it. On the other hand, the bigger the decision is, the more we tend to say, look, it's not just that I want to go to college that's good enough. I want to go to a college that's the best fit for me. It's going to give me the best education. And in those big decisions, you tend to try to maximize. And indeed, that's another way of taking this. To say, no, I want to make the world as well off as possible. I want to make myself as well off as possible. And often utilitarians, like Bentham in this passage, talk about the greatest happiness of the greatest number. They're talking about the greatest happiness. They're insisting that you maximize this and go for the best possible choice. Yeah?
Is there like a way to maybe quantify the happiness? Like, oh, if you do this action, that's 5 happy units or something?
You bet! There better be a way of quantifying this because we're talking about more and less. And so, yes, they're going to have a website. You get 5 units on that, right? 5 little happiness units, good to the world. You've got to do that, or this whole idea of putting things on a scale of more or less doesn't make any sense. So it is a crucial assumption of the utilitarians that we can actually take the effects of actions and put them on something like a numerical scale. Yeah?
But that wouldn't really work in practice. Like, right?
He says that wouldn't work in practice. Why not?
Well, imagine like if there's like someone about to get hit by a car, and so you have the option to save them or not to save them. And you sit there calculating like, all right, if I don't do this, then it's like that. But if I do, then it's that. So then you shouldn't be calculating. But like by this theory, you have to calculate every option to try to get like the maximum amount of utils.
Good. There are a number of objections that people raise to utilitarianism, a lot of which Mill responds to in his book Utilitarianism. And this is one. Wait a minute, if I'm going to be a utilitarian, I'm going to spend most of my life calculating. I mean, there's the bus about to hit the person. I am thinking, should I jump into the street? But wait, that risks my life, but I might be able to save them. On the other hand, what if I'm not fast enough? Then I won't save them, and I'll get hit too, and boom, the bus is already hit, right? Or I think, wait, the grenade in the foxhole, what should I do? Let me do a calculation now. And so, gosh, I've got this paper to write by Monday. What would be the best paper to write? Let me calculate. And all of a sudden it's like, oh no, it was due last, hour, and I'm still calculating. And so there is a problem here, and it's a real problem, not just a theoretical problem. In fact, it's a standard problem with government committees. Let's appoint a committee to investigate that. Well, who should be on the committee? Let's have a committee on committees to determine who's on the committee. There really is, in the faculty at UT, a committee on committees. I served on it one year. And it makes you think, well, why not a committee on committees and so on. But anyway, it gets a little crazy. And that is a worry. Now, Mill says, relax. When people go out to sea, do they have to calculate all the navigational charts from scratch? No. He says, we have had the entire history of the human race to perform calculations of a similar kind. You are really angry at somebody and you think, maybe I ought to kill him. And you have to do the complicated calculation. Mill says, no, we've got the whole history of the human race to say, on balance, murder is a bad thing. Okay? Murder is generally bad, so you don't have to spend the time on the calculation. On the other hand, the more complicated the situation, the more you might think, well, maybe I do have to calculate. Yeah?
We have the whole past of the human race. We don't have the future. How do we know what's going to bring happiness? What about the person who buys their wife something and it turns out this was linked in some ways to some traumatic event in her past? She starts crying.
Very good. We might know the past, but do we know the future? In fact, Descartes had a theory a little bit like this, and Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia ended up objecting to it on exactly those grounds. How do we know enough about the future? She says to Descartes, this would require an infinite knowledge. And indeed, you have to think about the long run, right? It might be that on the short run, this looks like a good move, but later it's not going to turn out to be. So you have to be able to look indefinitely far into the future. And how can you do that? So some people think this is just a recipe for skepticism, that you can never know really what's right. This is part of the reason that Bentham and Mill talk about the tendencies of actions, rather than the actual effects of the action. If you do something that would tend to have a good effect, even if in your case, through bad moral luck, it has a bad effect, we'll count that as a good action. Because you can't know, you're absolutely right, what the actual effect of your action will be. It might be that vaccinating that one child will produce that child's death. It might be that giving the person that particular birthday present will trigger these unpleasant memories and lead to a flood of tears. And so you can't be expected to know that. You can think about the general tendencies of the action, but that's what we use to determine whether this ought to be done. Now, this is a version of consequentialism. It says the only thing that matters ultimately in morality is the consequences of action, not questions of character, virtues, etc. It's not really intentions, it's not really motivations. In the end, what matters are consequences. This is also a universalist theory. Everybody's happiness matters, and matters equally. Yeah?
To what extent is this similar to the Machiavellian kind of like injustice idea?
Okay, there is an ends justify the means idea here, definitely. The end of producing as much happiness as possible does justify the means. It's the only thing that can justify the means. Now, in Machiavelli, he has in mind, cynically put, the good of the ruler. A little less cynically put, maybe the good of the state. Here, we're not thinking of those in independent terms. We're thinking about the happiness of each individual. And Bentham and Mill are both individualists. So if the happiness of the community is just the sum total of the happiness of the members. But nevertheless, you're absolutely right. You could say, well, wait a minute, then actually sometimes a murder could be justified, right? Because it would make people happier. Maybe what comes to mind is the assassination of Hitler. But you might also think, here's this person who's just miserably unhappy. Maybe if we just killed him, the amount of happiness in the world would rise. And so there could be all sorts of things that might, I don't know. Think about cases like this, where there's an innocent person who's been accused of a crime, and the crowd is baying for that person to be punished. And let's say you're the sheriff. If you hang that guy, then peace will return. If, on the other hand, even though you know he's innocent, but if you don't, the mob is going to go in, they're going to lynch this poor guy anyway, and they're going to tear apart the town and maybe kill you. You might think, ooh, best consequence is actually to hang the innocent man. And to a lot of people, that seems like a terrible outcome. So, there is a real ends justifying means worry about this. Now, what are we supposed to maximize, or at least have enough of? Answer is happiness. Yeah?
I'm sorry, just to clear this up, is consequentialism an opposing ideal to what Mill and Bentham believe?
No. It follows from what they believe. Okay? Mill and Bentham are both consequentialists. They think you should be worried about the effects of your action and how much happiness they produce. And anybody who thinks you should be worried about effects, ultimately, whether or not they then think about that in terms of happiness or in some other way.
Okay, sorry, because I thought you were saying that what matters is their intent and the tendency, not the consequence.
Well, the tendency, yeah, but it's not your intention that matters. It's the tendency of that kind of action.
Okay.
So they're really thinking about this in terms of primarily kinds of action. rather than each individual action. Now, you all are asking really sophisticated and hard questions, which means we have only 1 minute left. So I'm going to just go fast, because there are a couple of key ideas you need for the quiz. One is, what is happiness? Here it is not some broad thing that means living well. It just means pleasure in the absence of pain. Pleasure in the absence of pain. That's happiness. Pain in the absence of pleasure. That's unhappiness. Pleasure and pain are the only sources of value. That's a thesis known as philosophical hedonism. Now, we do have to consider everybody affected, not just ourselves. And we do this by means of the moral calculus. Think of all the possible people who might be affected. Think about the possible pleasures, the possible pains, those that are likely to improve. Think about the balance of pleasure over pain for the entire group. That is what you're trying to maximize, or at least have enough of. And I'm going to just leave out some of these cool dilemmas and go to this. Mill says, wait, you mean, actually Carlyle objects, you mean to say the good is just feeling good? Mill says, well, not exactly just feeling good. It's really the case that there are different kinds of pleasures. Some pleasures are a lot better than others. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Better to be a human being dissatisfied than a mere animal satisfied.